this session. There we go. Um, so yeah, welcome everybody. It'd be great if you could kind of introduce yourselves in the chat and say where you're from. Um, Thank you for taking time out of, I'm sure, your busy days to come and attend this. This is a new kind of series for Campaign Lab, where we're really keen to get kind of academics who are involved in our work and on our steering group, and kind of really invite them to share some of the amazing insights from their research with everybody here today, because you're all campaigners, and sometimes, like as campaigners, you want to stay across like the latest research and insights. So this series is really what this is about, and it's very much a kind of learn as we go series. We'll bring different academics each month, and they'll be kind of sharing what they know from their research, and we'll sort of take it from there. So yeah, the idea is definitely to push out the research and the knowledge, and we'll be learning as we go, so we can kind of amend the kinds of presentations and things that you're interested in as we go along. So do get in touch with Campaign Lab if you've got something you really want to learn about. And we will do our best to find an academic who is working on that. Also, it'd be great if everybody could mute themselves just for this part, because Florian's going to present, and then we'll do Q&A after. So I'm just going to hand over to Douglas, who's our research manager, who's going to introduce Florian, and then we can get started.
Thanks, Hannah. So Florian is an associate professor in political behaviour in the Department of Government at the London School of Economics, where he studies political campaigns using randomized field experiments that are conducted with partner organizations. His research aim is to identify causal effects of formal and informal interactions between citizens, politicians, and campaign workers on electoral mobilisation, opinion change, and political activism. Florian is also a member of Campaign Lab's Academic Advisory Board, where he has assisted us greatly. Oh, yes, Dan? No, where he has assisted us greatly. And I would like to hand over to Florian, and please give him a warm welcome on our very first academic presentation module we hope to do on a monthly basis. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Douglas and Hannah, for inviting me to speak to this group of practitioners. It's something which I really enjoy doing, which is really important to my to my own work. As Douglas already mentioned, is I am probably kind of as applied as it gets, I guess, in political science, or at least in most of those people who study election campaigns. I work together with campaigns, with political parties, with NGOs, with other type of organizations, to really evaluate what works in campaigning, particularly when as it pertains to mobilization efforts. So GOTV, get out the vote, as you will know, and persuasion as well. I've done that for like 12 years now, back to when I did my PhD. In different countries, I've done a lot of work in the UK, mostly with UK Labour and the Lib Dems and other kind of groups, but also in countries such as Germany. I'm originally from Germany, so I have a bit of a language advantage, I guess. So Germany, Austria, Switzerland. I've done some work in Bulgaria and some in the United States as well. So that's kind of I think my background. I've run about like 30, 40 RCTs myself. Now, this project that I'm going to talk about today includes some of that work, but not only. It is actually a reanalysis of 120 GOTV experiments that have been conducted all over the world. Good chunk of them has been conducted in the US, but we have also experiments in the UK, quite a few other European countries, such as Denmark, where there has been quite a bit of experimentation happening. And also in the global south. So the question that I'm asking here, together with my brilliant co-authors, which are Paco Tomas Valiente, Astrid Tarantina, and Peter John, is who is mobilized by GOTV interventions? So you will have read some of the brilliant work by, for instance, Don Green and Alan Gerber, right? I mean, so kind of what works kind of to get voters out to vote. This type of work talks, for instance, about the mode, and I briefly kind of reanalyze some of those questions in the beginning. So to recap, or to shake up things a little bit about kind of what works in campaigning, People have also looked at different types of messages, but what we're looking here at the moment is who are actually the type of voters that are most responsive to this type of GOTV interventions. And I'm going to talk about, like when I talk about type of voter, on the one hand, I'm going to talk about people's voting propensities, right? I mean, like, so how likely they are to vote, like based on data, demographic data, turnout data that we hold about them, that campaigns hold about them. For instance, past turnout, age, gender, ethnicity, this type of variables that are quite common in voter turnout databases. But I'm also going to talk about other demographics such as age, gender, ethnicity, those that are available there. I hope that's going to be a bit informative for you guys. And the reason for why I'm doing that on this kind of large sample of experiments is basically that if we want to look at what we call heterogeneous effects in basically as academics, but it's just basically differential effects. So who is mobilized more and who is mobilized less, we need bigger samples. We can't just do that on one experiment. We want to do that on a big sample of experiments, and we want to use individual level data for that. So, basically we got hold of 120 experimental data sets and reanalyzed them for that. As I've already mentioned some of that. GOTV interventions are really a cornerstone of modern campaigning, of the ground game, right? I mean, obviously there are other kind of parts to digital and so on, and Hannah will have talked a lot about that, or will talk about this, I hope, kind of in other kind of sessions here. But they are also the most studied randomized interventions across all of political science. So, I mean, like there are other types of interventions, particularly also in international development, where we've had a lot of different experiments in different places. But GOTV interventions have been very, very common, and they have been conducted for a good 20 years all over the world. So we really know a lot about that. So we know that they mobilize, that at least some of those kind of interventions mobilize voters. But we know less about, like how they affect the composition of the electorate, right? I mean, both in terms of who is mobilized along demographic lines, and then what that means as well. And I'm sure you'll have some questions about that for the partisan composition of the electorate, right? I mean, so if I mobilize more young voters, and if I mobilize more minority voters, for instance, then that might help, for instance, left-leaning parties, right? If I mobilize more higher propensity voters, they're often, say for instance, more highly educated, they're richer. That might have different implications for the partisan composition of the electorate. So these are some of the questions that I want to look into. There's been some prior work on that question, namely one paper by Ines Fowler and Vafrek, mostly on an American sample, which has showed that actually GOTV campaigns, a bit counterintuitively, are most effective on high propensity voters. Meaning, like they make people who are likely to vote even more likely to vote. And that has meant that some people have concluded from that they might increase actually also participatory inequality. Now, I'm going to preview some of my findings. That is not what we find. On a much larger sample of experiments, we actually do find that they decrease electoral inequality and they mobilize people around the middle of the distribution and not the most, like the most likely to vote. But those at the, basically at the, as we would expect, those that are have about a 50%, kind of 40% voting propensity. So the question I'm asking here, so are GOTV interventions more effective on higher voting propensity citizens? And I do that by reanalyzing 122 experiments, and we then meta-analyze with a big meta-analysis of intent to treat effects. Basically, this is the effect of the entire campaign, not those that have been treated, but the effect of the entire intervention. And conditional effect, basically, we do that by voting. We call that voting propensity bin. So we group voters into 5 different bins according to their voting propensities. So it's basically those that have a low voting, like a voting propensity between like 0 and 20, and 20 and 40 and 40 and so on. Yeah, 40, 60, 60, 80, 80, 100. I'm going to talk a little bit about the data set, which was a huge act to compile, as you can imagine. So we started with a large database of around 400 GOTV field experiments. This is basically all field experiments that have been published or that are out there on the internet. So there is a sample, obviously, of GLTV experiments that are not accessible to researchers. Say, for instance, the data that's been collected by the Analyst Institute. But this is everything that's publicly accessible. Some of those are, experiments that have been conducted with political parties, and they are partisan in nature. Others have been conducted by researchers. So this is basically a composite sample of those different experiments. We then match them with individual level data from a replication archive. So we download all this replication data. We email the people who have conducted those, and they have sent us their data. And the output, as I said, is individual level data from 122 experiments and 256 different interventions. And so here, basically, I show you these interventions that we have over time and across space. So basically, the biggest chunk is from the US, but increasingly, we also have more non-US experiments. And I'm sure we'll have even more non-US experiments, like thanks to Campaign Lab. Yeah, so that's basically the sample here. I'm very happy to answer any kind of questions a bit about this. Also more information there. So I wanted to start with a reanalysis actually of the effect of GLTV interventions by mode and region. I've run this analysis earlier in the week. Yeah, so this is really fresh off the fresh off the computer. Yeah. So this is the entire sample. What you see here, so this is door to door. These are emails, mailers. So this is flyers, for instance, in direct mail. These are phone-based interventions. These are text message-based interventions. The number here, just tells you how many experiments there are, yeah, that we can rely on. So there, for instance, there are 31 door-to-door experiments that we have reanalyzed, 17 email experiments, 96 mail experiments, and so on. Yeah. That means that if there are fewer experiments, there's less certainty, right? I mean, the little bars here, these are what we call confidence intervals. This is the uncertainty surrounding the estimate, which is basically that little dot here. Here you see this is just percentage points. Yeah, so basically this estimates that door-to-door on average increases to about 1.5 percentage points. Yeah, so that's the takeaway here. Emails don't work. For basically GLTV to get people, out to vote. These are mailers, phones, so these are, effects in about that kind of 1.2, 1.3 percentage points. Yeah. And the text messages that seem to be relatively effective, but the sample is quite small. Yeah, so there have been more text message-based experiments, but we couldn't get hold of the individual level data for those because a lot of them have also been conducted in Denmark, and Danish researchers are quite restrictive in what they can share on their kind of samples because they contain a lot of kind of identifiable information. Yeah, so that's the reanalysis here. Now I have something which might shock you a little bit. This is the whole thing divided into US-based experiments and non-US-based experiments. So I only have that for door-to-door leaflets and phone-based experiments because I only have one text message-based experiment outside of the US, and that's not enough to actually do a meta-analysis on. So what we're seeing here is actually that we don't really find that door-to-door is effective outside of the US. There are a couple of experiments, of a few key experiments in there. There are 3, I think, door-to-door experiments in there that had been conducted in the UK. The rest is outside of the UK. So if you were wondering if that's all kind of a UK sample, so I think we definitely need more evidence on that from the UK, yeah, because there seems to be quite a bit of cross-context variation on whether something is effective or not. And here I'm, in the non-US sample, I'm just pooling everything together. Yeah, so that's everything that's been conducted in Europe. There's also a couple of Canadian experiments, for instance, and in there. Yeah, it also seems to be the case that at least on that sample, mailers and phone-based GLTV seems to work better than in the US in Europe. Yeah, so we find quite a bit of contextual heterogeneity. So I guess the takeaway here is that we cannot just take what we know from the US and apply it here, because the effects of this type of modes might actually vary a little bit by country context. And that's also one of the reasons why we should be doing experiments here in the UK. Right? We can't just say, oh, that works in the US, it will also work in the same way in Europe. That's a good indication, but there might be differences. Now, so these are just the main effects, right, of this type of interventions. Now I want to talk about differential mobilization. So that's the question about who is mobilized to vote. And here I told you that I'm going to show you these effects by voting propensity bins. So basically, we estimate the voting propensity of each individual in the data set based on, pre-experimental information that we hold about this individual, like on, for instance, previous the turnout history, age, ethnicity, gender. These are the main I think these are the main variables. Some data sets have more information, but these four like ethnicity is not always available, but like I would say previous turnout, age, and gender is available most commonly across those experiments. And so those are people that had a very high previous, turnout propensity based on their previous behavior and data. These are people who had a very low turnout propensity, right? There are two different samples that I'm going to show you. The sample in the right panel, these are all experiments together. The sample on the left panel, these are those experiments that produce this, like basically a positive effect, where we have recorded the positive effect. The patterns are the same. Yeah. So basically, what you see here is that we have a kind of hump shape. So in contrast to what, say, other people have found, it's not those people who had the highest voting propensities that are more mobilized to vote. It's also not those with the lowest voting propensities. It is actually those in the middle. Yeah. Doesn't mean that GHV interventions are not effective on voters with low voting propensities or high voting propensities. It just means that they're more effective for those in the middle. Yeah. And now you might ask yourself why that is, right? So why would that be the case? And there are two explanations that we have here, and we can explain that actually quite well. One of them is contact rates. It is just much harder to contact people in those kind of low voting propensity bins. I'll show you that also by age, and I have a similar pattern by age. Very young people are also very hard to contact, and if you're a campaigner, you will know that that's true. Yeah. So contact rates pretty kind of linearly increase with your voting propensity. So I'm more easily able to get hold of you if you're more likely to vote. At the same time, though, this is what we call the local average treatment effect or the complier average causal effect. If I manage to actually, get hold of you, then I'm actually the people kind of who have the highest voting propensities are less responsive. They're less likely to actually turn out as a result of that contact than the people in the middle. So there seems to be some type of sweet spot in the middle where people are actually kind of get hold of these people, and as a response of contact, they are actually about to do something, which is to vote, and they wouldn't have done otherwise in the absence of that contact. So this is what we call the sweet spot for mobilization. People in the middle. This hump shape is particularly pronounced in the United States. It's a bit less pronounced in Europe, where actually we also find that the least, those with the highest voting propensities are least responsive. But we actually see that those in the in the lower voting propensity bin are quite responsive to that, and that is because the effects of actually, if I can get hold of people, the effects will be large, of that contact. The challenge is to get hold of people, but it's a bit easier to get hold of them in Europe than in the US, and that might also make intuitive sense to you for why that would be the case. Now I want to break this down like into not this kind of more abstract voting propensities, but like something that you can very easily kind of as picture, which would be like things such as gender, race, age. So these kind of common covariates that are available in data sets. Obviously, I'd also be extremely interested to do that by, say, education or income, but I don't have the data for that across, like most experiments. So what we see here is basically that there are no differential effects per gender or race. It's not the case that GLTV, interventions work better on white voters or black voters. This is mostly from the United States where this data is available. It's also not the case that they work better for men on men or for women. They work equally well on men or on women. Yeah, these are averages, right? Averages across all experiments. There might obviously be a case where it works better on men or on women, a specific type of intervention, but on average, they work equally well on these genders. There is something going on with age, though. So here again, I have binned people into different age groups. So these are 18 to 25-year-olds. These are 55 to 65-year-olds. These are kind of people who are older than 75. And what you see is basically that these interventions seem to be most effective with people who are about like kind of in their 50s. Yeah, they become less effective if people are really old. Are really old, I mean, sorry, are a bit older. And they're less effective for people who are amongst the youngest. Yeah? Again, it doesn't mean that they're not effective at all. They are effective, right? They're still like, I get like a percentage point effect here on young voters, but I get an effect of almost 1.8 percentage points amongst kind of people in their kind of 50s and 60s. And so again, you have this a little bit kind of hump shape pattern that I already kind of saw in the other graph, and that's again like a function of like a mix of contact rate and actually the effectiveness of contact if you manage to contact the person. Again, younger voters are harder to contact. Basically, that's what we find. Yeah, so I'll sum up kind of a little bit what I've just said. So we conduct the largest individual data meta-analysis, public, I would say, meta-analysis. Yeah, there might be kind of some more kind of private meta-analysis out there that are not accessible to us. In GATV research, we pull evidence from 122 experiments with 256 treatments. We do show that GATV campaigns are most effective on citizens with intermediate voting propensities, based on their prior turnout history and the demographic data we can use to estimate those voting propensities. So we think that these citizens lie in the sweet spot for mobilization. They have higher contact rates. They're responsive to being contacted. People like that have really high voting propensities, they're easy to contact, but they're not very responsive. People who have very low voting propensities, they are really responsive if you manage to contact them, but it's very hard to contact. Then GATV seems most effective on those aged 55 to 75, and the effectiveness is a little bit hump-shaped, right? I mean, least effective amongst the young and the old. It seems equally effective on white versus non-white citizens and on both genders. Yeah, I would also it would be very interesting to break that down further by ethnicity, but again, we unfortunately don't have the data to do that. So we have this very rough measure about kind of white versus non-white citizens in the US, and non-white in that case would be mostly African Americans and Latinos. Right? Okay, so that's my little presentation, and I'm looking forward to any kind of questions that you wanna throw at me, and I'd love to get into a conversation with you.
So we have sorry, Benjamin. I see that you put up a great question in the chat, as did Evie as well. But Benjamin.
Yeah, my question was just how, like, with the comparability between countries with low voter turnout, like in France and the US, with places where turnout is considerably higher, like in Germany. Is there any way to control for that? Does it particularly matter? What was the consideration there?
Yeah, thanks, Ben, and good to see you. Yeah, I have a slide for you, I think. So what you see here, this is basically the conditional intent to treat effects by electoral salience, which we proxy by control turnout. Yeah, by just the level of turnout in the control group. We can also do that more systematically by saying, is this a local election? Is that a kind of midterm election? Is it a presidential election? Is it a general election? Stuff like that. And we still have to code that data. So this will actually be part of a larger book. This is part of a paper, but then the data is also part of a larger book project, and we're still finishing some of the meta coding on contextual kind of variables. So we'll know much more about who exactly conducted that intervention, what the message was that was kind of deployed in an intervention, and the electoral context in which those were deployed. But for now, you have that this is above median turnout, and that's below median turnout, and you see pretty much the same kind of pattern. Yeah. It's a bit more pronounced in lower turnout elections, but it's also visible in higher turnout elections. So the patterns are not strikingly different. Does it answer the question?
Yeah, thanks.
Evie also asks, how does one go about interacting with this election salience?
Yeah, exactly. So I think that goes to the same point, right? I mean that Ben already asked about. So we'll have a better answer for you on this question soon, right? I mean when we have the data from all other from the whole metadata from those papers completed. What we seem to say is to find is just that which of others already, others we know that already, which is basically that effects are smaller in higher salient, are smaller when the electoral salience is higher. Yeah, so basically you will find smaller GLTV effects in a presidential election than in a local election. This should be relatively unsurprising. I will have a precise estimate of how large or how small those are for you soon. But the general pattern seems to hold, and that has already been shown by other researchers that these effects are small. They're not null, yeah, but they are smaller. And then like we do find that there is more, which is also makes probably intuitive sense. So if effects are larger, there is more variation to explain. Right? I mean, so you will have more differential effects if more heterogeneity in effects if effects are larger. But again, it's not zero when effects are smaller. You still find approximately the same kind of hump shape pattern. It's just the case that the differences in percentage points are just smaller.
And
Yeah,
Hannah,
I'm gonna come
sorry.
back. Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, if I can just follow up on that.
Of course.
Yeah, Florian, this is surprising to me. Like, I would have thought that in below medium turnout elections, we would see that you'd get a bigger effect on higher propensity voters. The theory being like they're easier to contact and they are people who are already in the habit of voting. And maybe they're not going to vote in this special election or this midterm or whatever, but they usually vote in presidentials. And then we would see your hump shape effect in presidentials. So I'm just surprised. It's interesting. I'm really surprised to see this, that it's hump shaped in both cases.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, from a theoretical point of view, you might expect that higher propensity voters would be kind of in that case probably more responsive. But like I guess partially does it. So what we do here. So this is not by so basically people's voting propensities. I can also send you the paper if you want. They're in a way absolute, right? I mean, so they are not kind of bound to the specific. Yeah, basically just thinking whether that might kind of impact what we find here, but I don't think it does because we have also done it both ways, and it does show the same pattern. So I sent you the full paper to you, and it might kind of we go into a bit more detail on the question there, but I don't think that we find something else depending on how we define voting propensities.
Yeah, that's an interesting question because
Yeah.
I guess some of the vendors apply like voting propensity by election.
Yes,
So,
exactly. So we don't do that.
right.
But we have done it, and the patterns don't change. So yeah. And we obviously we have our kind of voting propensity model that we run. It's our own model. We don't rely on voting propensities given to us by vendors. We do that based on the data that we have. So that it's consistent across experiments.
Thank you, Hannah.
That's a good question. Thank you.
Yeah, just a few questions on sort of like kind of concrete takeaways for campaigners. Also, just on that propensity thing, I think what's interesting is the middle ones are like the measure is different. So, like in the below median turnout elections, your effect on the middle seems a bit higher, which does make intuitive sense to me in the sense that they might not like know it's an election, so they're more likely to the effect might be higher on those middle people, whereas
So
actually on the other end they're different.
Yeah, it's exactly what I told you, right? I mean, like that the
Yeah.
effects are just larger in below median turnout elections, right? I mean, like for everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
which is
but
interesting.
especially for those in the middle. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, which might contradict a little bit what Evie kind of expected to see, right? But it's
Yeah.
basically what we find.
Yeah, no, very interesting. So yeah, really keen to know sort of concrete takeaways for campaigners. It sounds like knowing turnout history is really key, which makes me think that everybody should be making sure their March registers are up to date. I know those of you on the call from CLPs who are probably wrestling with this very question, but actually having a sense of somebody's history of turnout feels like it's really key in deciding like how you allocate GOTV efforts. Because yeah, you'll know to kind of go for low turnout or higher turnout. And actually, like a lot of the stuff from a lot of the elections recently have been changed depending on whether people turn out or not. And actually, low turnout voters, when they do turn out, have a huge difference to results. So actually, it's not to say that it's impossible to turn out low turnout voters. It's just they're harder to reach, but maybe worth actually putting effort into that. So yeah, I'm interested in your like views strategy wise for campaigners.
Mm-hmm. So that's a good question, right? I mean, what does it mean now? Yeah, well, I mean, it does mean that if you want to be most effective in your efforts and you have limited resources, you should be contacting those people in the middle of the distribution, I think. Yeah. I think it also tells you how big approximately that difference is, right? I mean, like because it's not only kind of, I guess we're often talking about this works or this doesn't work, but in the end we want to know how much more how big the difference actually is, because there might also be a different number of people in those bins, right? I mean that's what we are saying here. So our measure here allows for like there can actually be voters, a lot of voters can be kind of in the middle bin. Yeah, I mean in this kind of sense. Have medium voting propensities, and that can differ from election to election and from context to context, of course. And so depending on like how many of those voters are in those different bins, then you should distribute your efforts so that you're contacting those voters that are most likely to be responsive. Having these two variables in mind, right? I mean, who is going to answer the door, or who is going to pick up the phone, or who are you actually going to reach, and who are those and which types of people are most responsive to once you reach them. And these are not the same people, basically. That's what I'm saying. The people in the middle seem to be somewhere in that kind of sweet spot. I mean, I think it tells you also something which is a little bit intuitive, which is like, campaigners have complained to me about, students are very hard to reach. I'm professor at the university, like it's, and that's true, right? I mean, like based on what we find, younger people are harder to contact. Once you contact them, they're actually going to be responsive to it. So if you can figure out a good way of contacting them, that that would also be great. But it's hard, right?
We've
I
got a
guess
couple.
I have one
Sorry,
other
Florian.
takeaway. So there's some kind of, like often some people kind of ask me about, it's like, what are the kind of partisan implications of that? And what we find is that at least until very, very recently, this should help the left. Because it does lead to a composition which is basically it's still, like, so we do that much more in the paper. We look actually what that means for turnout inequality. And it does decrease turnout inequality because turnout in the electorate is already stratified, right? I mean, like people who have higher propensities are more likely to vote. So if I get more people in the middle in, that means that inequality is decreasing. And those people in the middle are more likely to vote for left-wing parties than the very, very people kind of at the top of those kind of voting propensities. We can also show that we have matched that to data from the United States, where we know attitudes and vote choice of those voters. This might have turned in the last election a little bit, and we're going to look into whether that still holds, say, for those experiments that were conducted post 2016 and so on. But in general, this pattern does hold.
We've got a couple of questions asking for an expansion on the impact of texting in relation to all the other methods. So one question asking for a comparison between texting as it compares to calling. Another one asking how reliable the results are for the impact of testing. And then another one sort of asking if these results for texting also includes WhatsApp and I suppose other sort of social media type messaging services like Telegram?
Yeah, a very good question. So the estimate on texting is less reliable. Well, it's not less reliable. It is just more uncertain. It's more uncertain than our estimate for mailers and phones. But that's because we have fewer experiments in the group. We have only 6 experiments that use texts. There have been more experiments have been conducted, but we couldn't get hold of all of the individual level data underlying those. So if you have conducted some experiments, I know some of you have in this room, and you want to share this data with us, we'd be extremely grateful. Now, what we see here is that text messages do seem to be quite effective. Yeah, seem to be very effective, right? But it is also the method where I have almost a lot of uncertainty about. So I would like to know more. I would like to kind of conduct more experiments, and I would like to get hold of more data, to know, to shrink those confidence intervals there. Yeah. And then, sorry, what was there another kind of related question to that?
Yes. Do these experiments also include WhatsApp? So other means of other messaging services similar to
Yes. So
simple text?
the category includes them, but I think it does include WhatsApp. I'm not sure if it would include Telegram or if we call it that as social media. I think in practice there won't be very many in there. I think at least 5 of those 6 are just box standard kind of text message experiments. Yeah. So there have been experiments conducted on WhatsApp. I'm sure about that. But I'm still think most of those actually have been conducted in the global south, and they're not in this analysis. So I can show you a little bit if you're interested. I mean, like, so we have a couple of experiments in there conducted in the global south, countries such as, for instance, Mexico, Ghana, other places, and effects are larger in the global south than they are in the global north. Partially, that's probably a saturation type of thing, right? I mean, there's just less of this type of campaigning going on. So if you can, use those channels to campaign, maybe then it's more effective. That would be one potential explanation. But again, like, the number of studies isn't super large. So that's the reason why we didn't include them here. Yeah, but I know
Great.
that for instance, that there's more kind of work using WhatsApp in the global south.
That makes sense. And a final sort of sub-question regarding text messages. How does texting compare with calling, sort of phoning? There's a question sort of asking for an expansion on the comparison between the two.
Yeah, so I mean, phone-based GTV seems to work. Yeah, it works in the overall sample. It works in the non-US sample. It works in the US sample. It also works in the US sample, surprisingly, almost approximately well as door-to-door in our kind of reanalysis sample. So yeah, the phone banking doesn't work. I mean, one question about phone banking is obviously kind of response rates, right? If those response rates decrease, we might be in a bit of trouble, right? I mean, so one of the things that we're doing for the book is we're looking at those effects over time. So we are going to look at, do the effects of, phone-based GTV decrease over time? Do the effects of door-to-door based GTV decrease over time? Right? And what you would expect if fewer people answer the phone over time, like fewer people answer the phone today than in 1998, which is the first experiment that we have, then the overall effect of the intervention should be lower. So that's I think the major kind of caveat that I have for those phone-based experiments. But I've conducted one myself in the UK, and the effects were relatively large.
And then Len has a question. Could you say more on the null of the door-to-door in Europe? What would you speculate this applies in the UK or is driven by experiments in Europe? Which might that be?
So actually, it doesn't necessarily seem to be driven by the UK. Yeah, that's my caveat to that. I mean, I have 3 experiments from the UK, door-to-door experiments from the UK. In there, the 2 significant results, one which is null. Yeah, 1 positive results, 1 is a null. I'm the null. So this is my experiment. It is there are quite a few experiments in there from the global, from the European North, like like Finland, Sweden, Denmark. They're quite well represented here, and they seem not very, they don't seem to be getting very big effects there. But again, the UK sample here is small. It's 3 experiments. Yeah, I mean, like we're gonna break it down for you in also like in the book, and we're still trying to get hold of a few more experiments there, but like there are maybe only 5 out there at the moment, I think, like door-to-door GATV experiments, that we can get hold of from the UK. So there's still a lot of uncertainty surrounding that, right? It's different still, like if the effect is like half a percentage point or if it is not. Yeah. It's still different because we are pooling a lot of countries together here. We want to know whether it works in the UK, right? There seems to be big differences here across contexts, right? I mean, so I really want to know whether, like Denmark might just work very differently than the UK, and the UK estimates are being swamped out here by more Danish studies at the moment. Yeah, so I mean, there's a bit of a caveat here, but on average, in the European sample, it doesn't seem to work. And so the reasons you asked me for the reasons for that, right? One thing that we're going to look at is contact rates. Yeah, are people less likely to answer the door in some contexts than in other contexts? And we're gonna have that. Basically, we're gonna be able to break it down. So is the problem the average causal effect? So if we contact people, they are not responsive, or is the problem the contact rate? And at the moment, I can't give you that answer because we haven't done it. But these are I mean, depending on what we find, I think this will give us a very good indication where the problem lies. Yeah, maybe we're just better contacting, not quite as good as contacting people, or again, our contacts might have declined. There might be obviously there are two other explanations out there. One of them has to do with targeting data, right? I mean, so our targeting data is not as good as in the US because we don't have voter rec, party rec, right? A lot of those countries, other than the UK, don't even ask for party identification. So campaigns might be contacting the wrong voters in a way. Instead of contacting their own supporters, they might be ending up contacting, support of the other party, and they are not responsive to contact. That is actually something that we have found. So part of it might be a problem of targeting data as well. Yeah, so again, like for people, if they can get their kind of voter IDs kind of done, that really I think that really helps. And I think so we're going to look at that more systematically. For instance, going to look into it like in samples that have good targeting data available versus samples that do not. But in those kind of European samples, some of those experiments will have had really no targeting data at all, or really crappy targeting data. So that's the second explanation that I might be able to give you. But I'm not entirely sure how valid yet that is, but it's something we're going to look into.
Thank you. And then Dan has a question noting the effectiveness of reform they have a very effective ground game. And then he asks if this data suggests that a better digital game would help us fight the far right, much better, be more effective at fighting the far right, essentially. Sort of what insights this research gains in helping progressives sort of combat the far right.
Mm-hmm. So on digital, so I'm a bit puzzled, to be entirely honest. So here we have some digital experiments, but not quite enough to meet and analyze them here. We're still collecting data on that as well. But the average effect will not be large. It will not be large here. It's not zero, but it's small. But it's also partially because we have quite a few experiments on voter rec. I mean, that I have also conducted myself. They were all null in the UK, unfortunately, using digital ads on media platforms, for instance, but also on Snapchat. But we have also quite a few experiments from the US that show that on GATV they are minimal, those effects, and not exactly null, but they are not huge. On the other hand, but then I'm kind of questioning, so is that all that social media is, running some kind of ad campaign in kind of Media Ad Manager? I'm not saying that social media effects are not real. I don't think that would be credible, also based on kind of more recent kind of anecdotal evidence I think that we have, right? But I think we're not very good at, if I'm entirely honest, I think we're not very good at kind of identifying them, because a lot of it might be either exposure to the medium itself, like exposure to X after kind of Elon Musk took it over. It's not necessarily the content of those ads. It's like kind of the entire thing, right? I mean, like in this land that you get over and over and over again. There's also kind of obviously there's been a change in algorithms. So we have quite good research that says that algorithms like, around 2000s weren't really the problem. They were less of a problem than we thought it was, but I think now they are a problem because people have like, just they use them for political ends, right? Which they hadn't done before. So this is getting more problematic. There's organic content. There is obviously misinformation campaigns that are happening on social media, and we're not measuring those, right? What we're measuring are the effects of ad campaigns that, like say, of ads that Labour could post on social media and so on. And those effects are positive, but they are not super large. So a reform in terms of like they have an amazing crowd game, I'm not so sure if I'm entirely kind of open with you. Not in a traditional sense, but it's also kind of, I guess, or at least they didn't have much of a ground game, I think, in the last election. Now you could say like, maybe then the kind of traditional crown game doesn't matter anymore, and I would also disagree with that, to be entirely frank with you, because what we see here is that it does still matter, right? We're gonna in the bigger project, we're gonna look at this kind of question: does it matter less today than it used to? Right? Is it becoming less effective over time? What we see is, I can give you a very kind of uncertain preview of some findings because it's based not on the entire sample of coded experiments that we have because we're still coding. It is that some methods have become less effective over time, but there has been innovation occurring to counter those. Basically, messages have become more effective over time. Yeah, so we have replaced, and modes have become less effective, more effective. So basically, we have replaced things that didn't work with things that did work over time. So it's true that things are becoming less effective over time, but we're dropping those that are becoming less effective and replacing them with things that are more effective. And so in the end, we see almost kind of stable effects over time. Say, for instance, in the effect of mailers, where we can look at that very well, where we can look at, like what hasn't worked in terms of messaging, for instance, on mailers, which has been replaced with some stuff that has worked better, say, for instance, social pressure type of messaging. And we see, so effects decline on mailers, and then we reintroduce social pressure mails, and they go up again. Yeah, so then there seems to be this kind of constant, innovation happening also on the campaign side, or on the academic side, and then that's kind of mutually kind of reinforcing. So I don't think the finding is today that the classic crown game doesn't work, except for, there is this finding for door-to-door in like non-US countries, and I'm still was a bit puzzled myself for why that is. And I think we need to look into that more carefully and do more experiments on it to see whether that's, if the UK is more like the US or less or more like Denmark.
So my apologies to Dan. I misquoted you. Dan, in fact, said that they have no ground game. We've got a question from Hannah Raditi. She asks you to expand on the issue of cost effectiveness. I'm just going to read the question verbatim. Is cost effectiveness, with people not answering the phone, the cost of phone banking versus texting has become sort of much higher? These studies just look at the results from contact. Where does cost / resource effectiveness come into relative to these results?
Yeah, it's a good question, right? And normally that's a key question for campaign with limited financial resources. So not for US campaigns sometimes, but like for European campaigns for sure. Yes, texts are more cost effective, of course. Obviously, the challenge is to get hold of people's numbers. Also in a kind of post-GDPR world, which is not entirely quite as easy, right? As then kind of knowing where they live, for instance. And yeah, so I mean, if you can get hold of somebody's mobile phone number, then you can text them. But that requires that you're able to collect that data before. Yeah, and people do that in different ways. Obviously, there are different surveys that are being done with constituents. There are multiple ways, right? I mean, of how to obtain that data, but you will not hold that data for everybody in your constituency. I think the constraint that you have, and in order for for that to really scale, you need to hold data on a lot of people, and I think that's the key challenge. Yeah. Otherwise, they seem to be effective again, but like in Europe, we just don't have enough experiments. So like we have one experiment in the UK that's a null that I conducted myself on a relatively small sample and back in 2012. Yeah, so it's we just want more experiments. Like that's the key here. This is mostly US data, yeah, which I showed you here. And in the US, yeah, it seems to be effective. Again, I'm sure there's much more proprietary data that I would like to look at on that kind of question. And again, the uncertainty here is relatively large, meaning the effect could be much smaller and they could be much more in line with the other kind of measures on cost effectiveness. Still, they will be, if the effect is there, they will be doing well, right? One of the questions is then also kind of how does that translate into voting propensities, right? Am I going to hold this type of data only for high propensity voters? Which I'm sure there's a correlation. I'm relatively certain there would be a correlation between kind of, holding this data and somebody being a higher propensity. And we know that it works less well for higher propensity voters. So, I guess our results tell you that you need to get this type of data for kind of medium propensity voters. Yeah, I guess.
Great, thanks, Florian. I want to hand it over to Hannah to finish us off. I know we got a few more questions. Hannah.
Cool. Yeah, thank you very much, Florian, for coming to speak to us about this. And just to kind of, give context over, this is very new research, which is attempting to do that massive meta-analysis. So it's incredibly useful. And I think we're still trying to understand what the kind of concrete learnings are for campaigners as well. But I think just from hearing this, it feels like we really need to kind of figure out how we can get people's mobile numbers. And also that we need to really build out the evidence base for the effectiveness of these different kinds of interventions within the UK, which thankfully is something that Campaign Lab hopefully will be able to work on a bit more this year. So thank you very much, Florian, for coming along. I'd also like to just launch a little poll/quiz. So if everybody could kind of hopefully respond to this, there's just two questions, which are sort of like, has what you've heard today going to change your approach at all? Because we're really keen to know that. And then also, would you like more of these presentations? And we're really open to kind of like, how these to structure them, how best to structure them. We basically know that there's a huge amount of insight in academic literature that at the moment we don't have access to. So we're really trying to like bring the academics to us to really like tell us how things could be better. Please do kind of feedback on things. So I'll just leave people to continue answering the poll. So far, there's 100% want more of these. That's a good sign. Really good sign. And then lots of people are saying, this is either backed up things that they're already doing, or anything else. So I think 16 out of 20 have participated. That's 80%. So if the final 4 people could just, we've got 17 out of 20 have now answered. And I'm just going to end this poll now and show people the results so you can see. So hopefully you can all see results on your screen. Most people think that this is new or they need to think about it, or no, they think it's been helpful and it's going to change how they're going to approach turnout. Some have said it's picking up what they've already been doing, and others have said like it's new and they need to think about it. and people do want more of this, which is great. So yeah, do get in touch and do sort of keep talking. Just in terms of what's going to happen to this recording, we will share this recording around. And Florian, would you be okay to share slides with people, or are you kind of at the stage where slides are kept with you?
No, I'm happy to share those slides. I mean, with the caveat that on the kind of big meta-analysis that is very fresh. So you know, starts might
Cool.
change a little bit if more data comes in. Also, like I just
Brill.
wanted to say is thanks a lot for you know, like for attending the session. And if you work for an organization that has either conducted some of those experiments and you would like to share the data with us to kind of give us a more complete picture of what's going on, or you are willing to conduct experiments, you know, please get in touch with, obviously, with Campaign Lab, also with me personally. You know, we're very keen to work together with political organizations. Yeah, to give you a bit of a kind of a more complete picture of what's going on. And as Hannah said, I mean, like, you know, like the ideal state would be to be able to do this type of meta-analysis kind of for the UK, right? Because I do think that what we have shown here is also that there are some contextual effects here, and context matters. We can't just kind of take what we know from one context and blend it into another kind of country. And so you know, I'm really grateful to Campaign Lab also to kind of, you know, like to really serve as this kind of hub to build up this type of evidence base.
Definitely. Amazing. Thank you again, Florian, for taking time out of your like busy day to talk to us. We really, really appreciate being able to kind of hear from academics on the front line who are really thinking about this stuff really deeply. Because it's so key for like campaigns. And as you said, like there are some really clear kind of things that we can start to think about here. And we need to keep building the evidence. So thank you everybody for coming along. Any thoughts and feedback, please do just email us because this is a kind of experiment in progress. And yeah, we will email around the slides and the recording. And we will also maybe summarize sort of the key takeaways from this as well. So there'll be kind of a written version of this too. So yeah, thank you everybody, and I hope you're all having a good Friday. And our next session will be probably on the 21st of February at 1 p.m. With Evie, who's actually on this call, who will be talking to us a little bit about relational campaigning. So that's going to be our next session of these. So yeah, do sign up for that when you see it. And yeah, thank you everybody.
Great seeing you. Thank you so much for coming along. Bye bye.
Bye.
Be in touch.
Bye everybody.
Here's my email.
Bye.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Real, we can share that as well, Florian.
Bye.
Okay. Bye everyone. Have a good Friday. Bye.
Thanks, pleasure. Bye bye.
Bye. So yeah, stop recording.